They said money couldn't buy happiness, but Mason Sterling believed it could buy him freedom. He walked into the Manhattan High Court wearing a $5,000 suit, holding his mistress's hand, ready to cut his wife loose with pennies on the dollar. He thought he was the king of the boardroom and the courtroom. He was wrong. He didn't know that the quiet woman sitting at the defense table had spent 20 years building a trap so intricate he wouldn't see it until the jaws snapped shut. This isn't just a divorce, it's an execution. Watch until the end to see how the billionaire lost everything in a single sentence. The heavy oak doors of the Southern District of New York courthouse didn't just open, they were pushed wide by a security detail that cost more than most people's mortgages. Flashbulbs popped like strobe lights in a nightclub, blinding and rhythmic, bouncing off the polished marble floors. Mason Sterling stepped into the chaos with the grin of a man who had already read the final script. At 48, Mason was the face of Sterling & Co., a tech conglomerate that had recently swallowed the artificial intelligence market whole. He was handsome in a rugged, manufactured way, teeth veneered to perfection, skin tanned from a week in Saint-Tropez, and a jawline that seemed to defy gravity. But the cameras weren't just there for him. They were there for the woman hanging onto his arm, draped in a red silk dress that was entirely inappropriate for a morning hearing. Juliana Jules Moretti, 24 years old, an influencer with 3 million followers, and, according to the tabloids, the future Mrs. Sterling. She smirked at the press, clutching a limited edition Birkin bag, looking less like a defendant in a divorce proceeding, and more like she was arriving at the Met Gala. "Mr. Sterling, is it true you're offering her $10 million to walk away?" a reporter shouted from behind the velvet rope. Mason paused, adjusting his cufflinks. He winked. "I'm a generous man, Dave, but let's just say I believe in fair market value." The crowd laughed. Mason Sterling always played to the crowd. He strutted down the center aisle of the courtroom, Jules clicking along beside him in stilettos that echoed sharply against the wood. He nodded to his legal team, a phalanx of sharks led by Silas Brock, a man known in New York legal circles as the Butcher. Brock was already arranging his papers, looking bored. "Sit down, Mason. Try to look somewhat remorseful," Brock whispered, though he didn't mean it. "Why?" Mason whispered back, sliding into the leather chair. "The prenup is ironclad. The company is in my name. The assets are offshore. She gets the lake house and the sympathy. I get the world." Mason swiveled his chair to look at the other side of the aisle. There sat Emmy Sterling. If Mason was the sun, burning, bright and loud, Emmy was a shadow. She wore a navy blazer that was at least 3 seasons old, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. She wore no makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She sat alone, save for her attorney, a woman named Evelyn Vance, who looked more like a librarian than a litigator. Mason felt a pang of pity, quickly replaced by annoyance. Emmy had always been like this, plain, practical, boring. She was the woman you married when you were a broke college student with an idea. She was not the woman you kept when you were a billionaire titan of industry. She stared straight ahead at the judge's empty bench, her hands folded calmly on a stack of manila folders. "She looks tired," Jules whispered, leaning into Mason's ear, her voice loud enough to carry. "Maybe she's ready to give up?" "She gave up years ago, babe," Mason scoffed. "This is just the paperwork." The bailiff's voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Alistair Thorne presiding." Judge Thorne was a legend in the circuit. He was 60 years old, with a face carved from granite, and a reputation for having zero tolerance for theatrics. He swept in, his black robes billowing, and took his seat. He peered over his spectacles, his gaze lingering on Jules's red dress with distaste before landing on Mason. "Be seated," Thorne grumbled. "Case number 492B, Sterling Valia Sterling. Petition for dissolution of marriage and division of assets." Thorne shuffled his papers. "I have reviewed the initial filings. Mr. Brock, you are representing the petitioner, Mr. Sterling. Ms. Vance, you are for the respondent, Mrs. Sterling." "Ready, Your Honor," Brock said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. He projected confidence, his voice smooth as velvet. "Ready, Your Honor," Evelyn Vance said. Her voice was quiet, almost raspy. "Let's not waste time," Judge Thorne said. "Mr. Sterling is petitioning for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences and is seeking enforcement of a prenuptial agreement signed in 1998. Is that correct?" "It is, Your Honor," Brock said, stepping into the open floor. He began to pace, a performance he had perfected. "My client, Mr. Sterling, built Sterling & Co. from a garage startup into a global empire. While he has deep respect for his wife of 25 years, the reality is that the marriage has broken down. We are offering Mrs. Sterling a generous settlement of $5 million, plus the property in Connecticut, which is more than fair considering she has not contributed to the business operations in over 15 years. Mason leaned back, crossing his legs. He caught Emmy's eye. She didn't blink. She didn't look angry. She looked calculating. It unnerved him for a split second. But then Jules squeezed his hand under the table, and the feeling passed. "Ms. Vance?" The judge turned to Emmy's lawyer. "Does the defense contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement?" Evelyn Vance stood up slowly. She didn't pace. She didn't use big hand gestures. She simply adjusted her glasses. "We do not contest the prenup, Your Honor," Evelyn said. A ripple of shock went through the gallery. Even Mason blinked. "She's folding, just like that." Silas Brock smirked. This was going to be easier than he thought. "However," Evelyn continued, her voice hardening slightly, "we contest the ownership of the assets listed by Mr. Sterling. My client contends that Mr. Sterling cannot claim the company as a marital asset to be divided, because Mr. Sterling does not own Sterling & Co." Mason laughed. It was a loud, barking laugh that echoed in the silent room. He covered his mouth quickly, but the damage was done. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Thorne snapped, "do you find something amusing?" "I apologize, Your Honor," Mason said, standing up, flashing his charming smile. "It's just, surely there is a mistake. I am the CEO. My name is on the building. I founded the company." "The defense suggests otherwise," Judge Thorne said, looking at Evelyn. "Explain, Ms. Vance." "Mr. Sterling is indeed the CEO," Evelyn said calmly. "He is a paid employee, but the actual ownership of the holding company that controls the intellectual property, the patents, and the majority voting stock belongs to a private trust. And today we intend to prove that the beneficiary of that trust is not Mason Sterling." Mason leaned over to Brock. "What is she talking about? I signed the incorporation papers myself." Brock looked less confident now. He was shuffling through his files frantically. "It's a delay tactic, Mason. She's grasping at straws. Just let me handle it." But as Mason looked across the aisle, he saw Emmy finally turn her head. She looked at him, and for the first time in years, he saw a spark in her eyes. It wasn't love. It wasn't hate. It was the cold, clinical look of a predator watching prey walk into a trap. The air in the courtroom had shifted. The humidity of the crowded gallery seemed to drop, replaced by a chilling curiosity. The reporters in the back row stopped typing on their phones and leaned forward. "Mr. Brock," Judge Thorne said, leaning back, "call your first witness, let's get to the bottom of this ownership dispute. I call Mason Sterling to the stand, Brock announced. Mason buttoned his jacket and walked to the witness box. He swore on the Bible, his hand steady. He was in his element now. He was a storyteller, a visionary. He had sold billions of dollars of vaporware to investors. Selling a story to a judge should be easy. Mr. Sterling, Brock began, pacing comfortably again, tell the court about the founding of Sterling & Co. It was 1999, Mason began, his voice taking on that nostalgic TED Talk quality. I was working out of a small apartment in Brooklyn. I had a vision for a new type of data compression algorithm. Emmy she was around, of course. She was working as a librarian to pay the rent while I coded. I worked 18 hours a day. I built the code from scratch. I pitched it to investors. I took the risks. And what was Mrs. Sterling's role during this critical growth period? Brock asked. She kept the apartment tidy, Mason said with a shrug. She made coffee. She was supportive, emotionally, I suppose. But she never understood the tech. She never sat in on board meetings. She was happy to stay in the background. So to be clear, Brock pressed, she contributed zero intellectual property to the company? Zero, Mason confirmed. And the company structure? I incorporated in Delaware in 2001, Mason said. Sole proprietor initially, then we went public in 2010, but I retained 51% of the voting stock through my private holding company, MS Ventures. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. Brock sat down, looking satisfied. Evelyn Vance stood up. She picked up a single piece of paper, a photocopy of an old, coffee-stained napkin. Mr. Sterling, Evelyn said, walking to the stand. You mentioned you wrote the code from scratch. Do you recognize this document? Mason squinted at the paper. It looks like some old notes. This is a napkin from Sal's Diner, dated November 14th, 1998, Evelyn read. It outlines the core logic for the compression algorithm. The handwriting. Is it yours? Mason hesitated. It looks like mine. Look closer at the variables, Mr. Sterling, specifically the syntax used for the recursive loop. Mason stared. A bead of sweat formed on his temple. He knew that syntax. He hated that syntax. It was efficient, brutal, and mathematical. It wasn't his style. That's not my handwriting, Mason admitted quietly. No, Evelyn said. It's Emmy's. Objection, Brock stood up. Relevance? Goes to the credibility of the witness and the origin of the asset, Your Honor, Evelyn said coolly. Overruled, Judge Thorne said. Continue. Evelyn turned back to Mason. Mr. Sterling, is it true that in 1998 you were on academic probation for failing linear algebra? Mason's face flushed red. Jules, sitting in the gallery, lowered her sunglasses, looking confused. I struggled with some courses, yes, Mason snapped. And who tutored you? Emmy did, he muttered. Emmy, who was a PhD candidate in mathematics at Columbia University, before she dropped out to support you, Evelyn corrected. Mr. Sterling, isn't it true that the Ether Code, the foundation of your billion-dollar empire, was actually solved by your wife on this napkin while you were complaining about the math being impossible? She helped, Mason shouted, losing his cool. She helped with the math, but I built the company. I sold it. I made the deals. An equation is just numbers on a page until someone like me turns it into money. So you admit she created the intellectual property? I admit she helped. Thank you, Evelyn said. She walked back to her table and picked up a thick, leather-bound binder. Now, let's talk about MS Ventures, the holding company you claim to own. She opened the binder. You stated you incorporated MS Ventures to hold your stock. And you signed all the documents yourself? Yes, Mason said, feeling safer now. He remembered signing the stack of papers. Emmy had brought them to him one night while he was drunk on champagne after their IPO. She said they were just tax shelters. He had signed them without reading. And do you recall the nominee agreement embedded in Article 4 of the incorporation bylaws of MS Ventures? The what? Mason frowned. Article 4, Evelyn read, states that Mason Sterling serves as the public face and nominee director of the entity, possessing no beneficial ownership, while the true and lawful owner remains the silent partner. The courtroom went deadly silent. That's legal mumbo-jumbo, Mason scoffed. I'm the owner. Mr. Sterling. Evelyn looked over her glasses. Who is the registered silent partner of MS Ventures? I don't know. It's probably me under a different tax ID. Evelyn turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit B, the original incorporation documents of MS Ventures. She handed a document to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. Judge Thorne adjusted his glasses. He read the line. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He looked at Mason, then at Emmy, then back at the document. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, his voice dropping an octave. According to this, you are effectively an employee of MS Ventures. That's impossible, Mason yelled, standing up in the witness box. Who is the owner then? Evelyn Vance smiled. It was a small, terrifying smile. The owner is listed as a blind trust, Evelyn said. The Aurora Trust. And who controls the Aurora Trust? Mason demanded. Emmy Sterling spoke for the first time. She didn't stand up. She didn't shout. She simply leaned into her microphone. I do, Mason. Her voice was calm, clear, and devastating. I named it Aurora, Emmy continued, because that was the name of the daughter we lost. The daughter you missed the birth of because you were at a business meeting in Vegas. The color drained from Mason's face. The mistress, Jules, dropped her phone. It clattered loudly on the floor. You signed the rights over to me in 2010, Emmy said, staring into his eyes. You were too busy celebrating your first billion to read the contracts. You wanted the credit, Mason. So I let you have the credit. But I kept the control. This is a lie, Mason screamed, looking at his lawyer. Brock, fix this. Silas Brock was frantically reading the copy of the document Evelyn had slid to him. He looked pale. He looked up at Mason and shook his head slightly. The signature is real. Order! Judge Thorne banged his gavel. Mr. Sterling, sit down or I will hold you in contempt. Mason slumped back into the chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Jules. She was already texting someone, probably her agent. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Ms. Vance, Judge Thorne said, looking intrigued. If Mrs. Sterling owns the holding company, why are we here? Why hasn't she fired him? Oh, she intends to, Your Honor, Evelyn said. But first, we need to address the matter of the company funds Mr. Sterling has been spending on Miss Moretti. Evelyn turned toward the gallery and pointed a finger directly at the mistress. We are calling Juliana Moretti to the stand. Jules froze. She looked at Mason. I didn't sign up for this, she hissed. You have been subpoenaed, Ms. Moretti, Judge Thorne said sternly. Take the stand. As Jules stood up, smoothing her red dress, Mason realized the ground was shifting. He had walked in here thinking he was the hero of his own movie. He was starting to realize he was just the villain in Emmys. Juliana Jules Moretti sat in the witness box, looking like a cornered exotic bird. The harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom did no favors for her heavy contour makeup. She crossed her legs, uncrossed them, and then glared at Mason. Ms. Moretti, Evelyn Vance began, her voice deceptively gentle. Thank you for joining us. I know this must be inconvenient for your schedule. I have a brand activation in Miami tomorrow, Jules snapped, her voice raising in pitch. This is harassing. I have nothing to do with their marriage. On the contrary, Evelyn said, picking up a stack of credit card statements that was 3 inches thick. You are the primary beneficiary of the Sterling and Cumsel Discretionary Fund for the last 18 months. I don't know what that is, Jules said, checking her manicure. Mason buys me things. He's my boyfriend. That's not a crime. It depends on whose money he uses, Miss Moretti. Evelyn walked closer to the stand. Let's look at item 14B, a penthouse apartment at 432 Park Avenue, purchased 6 months ago for $12.4 million. Who holds the deed to that property? Mason bought it for me, Jules said proudly. It's in my name. Actually, Evelyn corrected, it is held by a shell company called Jules M. LLC. And who funded Jules M. LLC? Mason did. Wrong again. The funds were wired directly from MS Ventures, the holding company owned by my client, Mrs. Sterling. Evelyn turned to the judge. Your Honor, effectively, my client, Mrs. Sterling, bought this woman a $12 million apartment without her knowledge. The courtroom gasped. Emmy remained impassive, staring at her hands. Now, Evelyn continued, flipping a page. Let's talk about the jewelry. A 5-carat canary yellow diamond necklace, valued at $800,000. You're wearing it in your Instagram post, dated July 4th, captioned, My baby treats me like a queen. Is that correct? Yes, Jules said, her voice trembling slightly. She instinctively reached for her neck, though she wasn't wearing the necklace today. That necklace was purchased using the corporate American Express Centurion card issued to the CEO of Sterling and Cumsel, Evelyn said. Under the corporate bylaws, personal use of company funds over $10,000 requires board approval. Did Mason Sterling show you a board resolution approving your necklace? I don't know about board resolutions, Jules shouted, looking at Mason. He told me he owned everything. He told me he could buy whatever he wanted. He lied to you, Evelyn said simply, just as he lied to the shareholders. Evelyn walked back to her table and picked up a document. Ms. Moretti, are you aware of the legal concept of clawback? Jules blinked. What? Since these items, the apartment, the cars, the jewelry, the vacations to Bora Bora, were purchased with embezzled funds from a company Mason Sterling did not own, they are considered proceeds of theft. Mrs. Sterling is suing for the immediate return of all assets. Jules stood up, her eyes wide with horror. You can't take my apartment. I renovated the kitchen. It's not your apartment, Evelyn said coldly. It belongs to the Aurora Trust. It belongs to Emmy. Jules whipped her head around to scream at Mason. You told me you were the king. You told me she was a broke housewife. You fraud. Jules, baby, calm down, Mason pleaded from the defense table, sweating profusely. It's a misunderstanding. My lawyers will fix it. Fix it? Jules laughed, a shrill, hysterical sound. You're broke, Mason. You're spending her money on me, and now she wants it back. She looked at the judge. Your Honor, I didn't know. I thought he was rich. I'm a victim here. He manipulated me. You accepted $12 million in gifts, Judge Thorne said dryly. Ignorance is not a defense for receiving stolen goods. You may step down, Ms. Moretti, but do not leave the state. The asset seizure team will be in touch. Jules stormed off the stand, grabbing her bag. As she passed the defense table, she didn't look at Mason. She looked at his lawyer, Silas Brock. Call my agent. I'm selling the exclusive rights to this breakup story to TMZ within the hour. Mason put his head in his hands. The humiliation was burning him alive, but he wasn't defeated yet. He still had his ace in the hole, or so he thought. The courtroom settled after Jules's dramatic exit. Silas Brock looked at Mason with a mixture of disgust and panic. "We need to settle," Brock whispered. "Now, before this gets worse. Give her the 50%. Beg for mercy." "No," Mason hissed, his eyes bloodshot. "She embarrassed me. I'm going to burn it down. If she owns the company, fine. But she doesn't own me. And she doesn't know about the accounts she couldn't track." Mason stood up. "Your Honor, I would like to address the court regarding the financial status of Sterling & Co." Judge Thorne raised an eyebrow. "Against the advice of your counsel?" "My counsel is an idiot," Mason spat. Brock threw his pen down and leaned back, washing his hands of the situation. "Go ahead, Mr. Sterling," the judge said. "My wife claims she owns the holding company," Mason said, his voice regaining some of its old swagger. "And maybe, through some trickery with the paperwork 20 years ago, she technically does. But a company is just paper. The money, the actual liquid cash, that's a different story." He smiled cruelly at Emmy. "You see, Your Honor, for the last 5 years, I have been diverting profits into offshore investments, high-risk, high-yield accounts in the Cayman Islands and Zurich, accounts that are not under the umbrella of Sterling & Co. or MS Ventures. They are in my name alone, the Omega Fund. There's over $200 million in there, and since I earned it through my trading expertise, it's mine." Mason looked at Emmy, expecting to see fear. He wanted to see her realize that even if she had the company, he had the war chest. Emmy didn't look scared. She looked bored. She slowly poured herself a glass of water. Evelyn Vance stood up again. She looked at Mason with pity. "Mr. Sterling," Evelyn said, "you are referring to the Omega Fund, account number 889 Swiss X?" Mason froze. "How do you know the account number?" "And the Cayman accounts," Evelyn continued, listing them off from memory. "The Blue Sky Shell Corporation in Panama, the crypto wallet on the hard drive in your safety deposit box at Chase Manhattan." "Those are private," Mason yelled. "Those are encrypted." "I call Arthur Pendergast to the stand," Evelyn announced. The doors opened, and a man who looked like a human calculator walked in. He wore a grey suit that blended into the walls. He carried a laptop. "Who is this?" Mason demanded. "Mr. Pendergast is the chief forensic accountant for the IRS," Evelyn said pleasantly. "But before that, he was a private contractor I hired 4 years ago." Arthur Pendergast took the stand. He didn't need to be prompted. He plugged his laptop into the court's display system. A spreadsheet appeared on the large monitors hanging from the ceiling. "Mr. Pendergast," Evelyn said, "can you explain the nature of the Omega Fund that Mr. Sterling is so proud of?" "Certainly," Arthur said, his voice monotone. Mr. Sterling believed he was siphoning money out of Sterling & Co. into private accounts. He used a series of shell companies to do this. However, he used the company's own server infrastructure to execute the trades. Mason felt his stomach drop. "So, that's just bandwidth." "Not exactly," Arthur said, "because the servers belong to Sterling & Co., and Sterling & Co. is owned by the Aurora Trust. All data passing through those servers is subject to the Trust's oversight. Mrs. Sterling saw every penny you moved." "She saw it?" Mason whispered. "Why didn't she stop me?" Arthur clicked a button. The spreadsheet changed colors. "Because she wanted you to consolidate it," Arthur said. "You see, Mr. Sterling, you are a very aggressive trader. You took risks Mrs. Sterling would never take with the main company. You gambled with the money, and you won. You turned 50 million into 200 million. "Exactly," Mason shouted. "My genius." "But," Arthur interrupted, When you set up the Swiss accounts, you used a power of attorney proxy to hide your identity. You didn't want your name on the documents to avoid taxes. Standard practice, Mason muttered. The proxy you used, Arthur said, a small smile touching his lips, was a law firm in Zurich called Vance and Associates. Mason looked at Evelyn Vance, the librarian-like lawyer. No, Mason breathed. No, no, no. Yes, Evelyn said from her table. You hired my brother's firm in Zurich to hide your money. You didn't check the name. You just wanted the cheapest rate. The contract you signed, Arthur continued, grants the proxy, Evelyn Vance's firm, total control over the assets in the event of legal incapacitation or criminal investigation of the primary holder. Arthur tapped a key. And since you just admitted in open court to embezzling funds from Sterling & Co. to fund these accounts, that constitutes a criminal investigation. The clause is triggered. The screen flashed red. Assets frozen. Transfer initiated. As of 30 seconds ago, Arthur said, closing his laptop, the Omega Fund has been absorbed back into the Aurora Trust. You successfully laundered the money, multiplied it, and then handed it right back to your wife. Minus a hefty fee for my services, of course. Mason fell back into his chair. He couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. $200 million. Gone. In a keystroke. She played you, Silas Brock whispered, staring at Emmy with newfound respect. She let you break the law to make the money, and now she's using the law to take it back. This is entrapment, Mason wheezed. No, Judge Thorne said, looking down from the bench with a grim satisfaction. This is karma, Mr. Sterling, and we aren't finished yet. The news had already broken. While the court was in a brief recess for lunch, the world outside had exploded. CNBC was running a breaking news banner. Billionaire broke. Wife owns it all. Twitter was trending. Or Sterling crash. The stock price of Sterling & Co. was wobbling, dropping 10% on the uncertainty. Mason sat in the holding room, his tie undone, staring at a wall. He had refused to eat. Silas Brock had left to make a phone call and hadn't come back. When the bailiff called them back in, the courtroom was even more crowded. There were men in expensive suits standing in the back, members of the Sterling & Co. board of directors. Mason walked in, looking haggard. He saw them. Jim, Mason said, spotting the chairman of the board, Jim Galloway. Jim, you have to help me. Tell them I'm essential. Tell them the company dies without me. Jim Galloway, a man Mason had played golf with for 10 years, didn't smile. He looked at Mason like he was a dead insect on a windshield. We had an emergency meeting via Zoom during the recess, Mason, Jim said coldly. And we voted. Judge Thorne banged the gavel. Court is back in session. I understand there is a new development. Evelyn Vance stood up. Yes, Your Honor. We are moving to the final phase of the dissolution, the employment contract. Mr. Sterling, Judge Thorne said, please stand. Mason stood, his legs shaking. Evelyn held up a single sheet of paper. Mr. Sterling, your contract as CEO contains a morals clause. It states that any executive who brings public disrepute, scandal, or criminal liability to the firm can be terminated for cause, effective immediately, with no severance. I built this company, Mason roared, his voice cracking. I am the face of it. You can't fire me. The stock will tank. Emmy stood up. She walked around the table and stood directly in front of Mason. She was small compared to him, but in that moment, she loomed like a giant. The stock is dropping because of uncertainty, Mason, Emmy said quietly. The market hates chaos, and you are chaos. She turned to the back of the room. Jim Galloway stepped forward. The board has unanimously voted to terminate Mason Sterling as CEO, effective immediately. We have also voted to appoint the new interim CEO. Who? Mason laughed hysterically. Who can replace me? You. You're a bean counter, Jim. Not me, Jim said. He pointed to Emmy. Mason's jaw dropped. You're a housewife. You haven't worked in 20 years. I haven't worked for you, Emmy corrected. But did you really think I just sat at home knitting? Who do you think wrote the white papers for the Nexus AI project, under the pseudonym E.S. Turing? Who do you think advised the board on the acquisition of Data Core last year? Mason blinked. The Nexus project was their biggest upcoming product. He had never met the lead engineer. He just signed the checks. That was you? He whispered. I have been running this company from my study in Connecticut for a decade, Mason, Emmy said. You were just the mascot. You shook hands. You cut ribbons. You gave interviews. You were the peacock. But I was the one making the decisions. The board has known for 5 years. We were just waiting for your contract to renew, so we could lock in the non-compete clause. She smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile. You're fired, Mason. And because of the non-compete you signed last month, thinking it was just a formality, you can't work in the tech industry for 7 years. You can't even consult. Mason looked at the board members. They all nodded. They were in on it. They had all been playing him. Why? Mason asked, tears finally streaming down his face. Why let me go on like this? Why let me think I was a god? Because I wanted to see if you would ever change, Emmy said, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. I gave you 20 years, Mason. I forgave the first affair. I forgave the gambling. I forgave the neglect. I kept waiting for the man I fell in love with in that Brooklyn apartment to come back. She leaned in closer. But when you missed Aurora's funeral to close the Tokyo deal, that's when I decided. I didn't just want a divorce. I wanted to erase you. I wanted you to feel what it's like to be invisible. She stepped back. Your Honor, Emmy said, turning to the judge. I am ready to sign the divorce decree. I am taking the company, the house, the assets, and the dog. He can keep his clothes and his mistresses. So ordered. Judge Thorne slammed the gavel down. Judgment for the respondent. Mason stood alone in the center of the courtroom. The flashbulbs were still popping, but they weren't for him anymore. They were for Emmy, the new queen of tech. The board members were surrounding her, shaking her hand. Jules was gone. His lawyer was gone. He had walked in a billionaire. He was walking out with nothing but a suit he probably couldn't afford to dry clean. But as he turned to leave, a man in a cheap trench coat blocked the aisle. Mason Sterling? The man asked, holding up a badge. Get out of my way, Mason muttered. I'm Agent Miller, FBI, Financial Crimes Division, the man said, producing a pair of handcuffs. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding the embezzlement of funds from MS Ventures and tax evasion related to the Omega Fund. Ms. Vance sent us the files this morning. Mason looked back at Emmy one last time. She was busy talking to Jim Galloway about the Q3 earnings report. She didn't even look up as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The transition from a penthouse overlooking Central Park to a 6x8 cell in the Federal Correctional Institution at Otisville was not gradual. It was a violent, jarring fracture in reality. Mason Sterling had spent his life curating his environment. He controlled the temperature, the lighting, the sound, and the people. He wore vicuña wool and drank scotch that was aged longer than his cellmate had been alive. Now, he wore an ill-fitting beige jumpsuit that smelled of industrial detergent and stale sweat. His first week was a blur of denial. He kept waiting for Silas Brock to burst through the heavy steel doors, waving a court order, laughing about how it was all a stress test for a new security protocol. He paced the small concrete floor, muttering to himself. "I am Mason Sterling," he whispered, tracing the cracks in the cinder block wall. "I built the future. This is a mistake." But the mistake was his existence. By the third month, the denial had hardened into a bitter, poisonous rage. The other inmates didn't care about his stock portfolio. To them, he was just another suit who got caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He wasn't a titan of industry here. He was inmate .894C2B, and he was on the bottom rung of the ladder. His only connection to the world he once owned was the television in the common room. He was allowed 1 hour of viewing time a day. 6 months into his sentence, on a rainy Tuesday, Mason sat on a plastic chair, watching Bloomberg TV. The volume was low, drowned out by the slapping of playing cards at a nearby table, but the headline screamed at him in bold white letters. Sterling & Co. rebrands to Ether Dynamics. Stock hits all-time high. Mason leaned forward, his heart thumping against his ribs. The screen cut to a live feed of a press conference. There she was. Emmy stood at a podium made of reclaimed glass and steel. She looked transformed. The severe bun was gone, replaced by a sleek, modern cut that framed her face. She wore a white suit that radiated power, not the aggressive, loud power Mason had wielded, but a calm, absolute authority. She looked younger, lighter, as if shedding him was the fountain of youth. "We are entering a new era," Emmy spoke into the microphones, her voice steady. "The era of ethical innovation. We are stripping away the volatile practices of the past. We are liquidating the offshore risks. We are bringing the jobs back home." The crowd erupted in applause. "And," Emmy continued, a small smile playing on her lips, "we are launching the Nexus project ahead of schedule. This is the culmination of 20 years of research." Mason gripped the edge of the plastic chair until his knuckles turned white. Nexus. That was his vaporware. He had sold the concept to investors on a lie. He never thought it could actually work. How had she finished it? The camera panned to the people standing behind her. He recognized Jim Galloway, looking smug. He recognized the new CFO. But then, the camera lingered on a young woman standing to Emmy's right. She was striking, perhaps 22 years old. She had dark hair, piercing eyes, and a posture that was eerily familiar. She held a tablet, whispering something to Emmy, who nodded with evident pride. "Who is that?" Mason muttered to the screen. "Hey, shut up, old man." A massive inmate named Davis grunted from the table behind him. "We're trying to play spades." "Look," Mason pointed, his hand shaking. "That girl, who is she?" The news anchor's voiceover provided the answer. Joining CEO Emmy Sterling is the newly appointed Vice President of Operations, the enigmatic prodigy known only as Rory, who sources say has been the chief architect behind the Nexus Code. Rory. The name struck Mason like a physical blow. It triggered a memory, a faint, dusty fragment from a life he had thrown away. Aurora. He remembered Emmy calling their baby Rory in the hospital, the one time he had visited before flying to Tokyo. But Aurora was dead. She had died in a car accident when she was 16. Or was it leukemia? He couldn't remember the details. He had been in the middle of the merger with Techstar. He remembered getting the call. He remembered telling his assistant to send the most expensive flowers available. He remembered the funeral being on a Tuesday, which conflicted with his board meeting. So he had flown in for 20 minutes, stood by the closed casket, checked his watch, and left. He had never looked inside the casket. A cold dread, colder than the prison walls, seeped into his bones. He stared at the girl on the screen. She turned her head, and the studio lights caught her profile. It was his nose, it was his jawline, but it was Emmy's eyes. No, Mason wheezed. That's impossible. Time's up, Sterling, the guard shouted. Back to the cage. Mason didn't move. He couldn't move. I said move. The guard grabbed his arm and hauled him up. Mason stumbled back to his cell, his mind fracturing. She died. I paid for the funeral. I have the death certificate in the safe. The safe that Emmy controlled. He sat on his bunk, rocking back and forth. He needed to know. He needed to see her. He filled out a visitation request form with trembling hands. He addressed it to Emmy Sterling. He didn't expect her to come. The waiting room of the Federal Correctional Institution at Otisville was designed to strip a man of his dignity, 1 minute at a time. For Mason Sterling, a man who used to measure his time in thousands of dollars per second, the waiting was a torture worse than the confinement itself. He sat on a cold, bolt-down metal stool, his wrists chafed raw by the handcuffs that chained him to the table. The room smelled of industrial bleach and despair. The fluorescent light overhead flickered with a maddening, rhythmic buzz. Zust, 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 that felt like it was counting down the seconds of his remaining sanity. It had been 3 weeks since he saw the broadcast, 3 weeks since he saw the face of a ghost on Bloomberg TV. He had replayed the image in his mind 1,000 times in the darkness of his cell. The sharp jawline, the dark, intelligent eyes, the way she stood next to Emmy, not like a subordinate, but like a warrior guarding her queen. Rory. The heavy steel door on the visitor's side clanked open. Mason flinched. Emmy walked in. The visual contrast was violent. In this grey, lifeless box, she looked like a high-definition image projected against a dirty wall. She wore a cream-coloured cashmere coat that probably cost more than the guard's annual salary. Her hair was perfect. Her skin was luminous. She didn't look like a woman who had just gone through a high-profile divorce. She looked like a woman who had just been reborn. She sat down gracefully on the other side of the thick, scratched plexiglass. She didn't pick up the phone receiver immediately. She just looked at him. She studied his greying hair, the dark circles under his eyes, the trembling of his hands. She looked at him like he was a rounding error in a ledger, something to be corrected and forgotten. Mason fumbled for the black handset, his chains rattling loudly against the metal table. "You came," he rasped. His voice was rusty from disuse. Emmy picked up her phone. "You filled out the request form, Mason. You marked it urgent, life or death." I was curious to see which one it was. "Cut the Ice Queen act, Emmy," Mason snapped, trying to summon the commanding baritone that used to silence boardrooms. But here, behind the glass, he just sounded desperate. "I saw the news. The rebrand. Ether Dynamics." "It's a good name," Emmy said calmly. "It references the Ether Code, the code I wrote. It seemed appropriate to finally put the correct signature on the work." "I don't care about the name." Mason leaned forward, his breath fogging the glass. "I care about the girl, the vice president, the one the press is calling a prodigy, Rory." Emmy's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What about her?" "Is she—" Mason swallowed hard, a lump of fear and hope lodging in his throat. "Is she Aurora?" He waited for the denial. He waited for Emmy to tell him he was crazy, that it was a niece, a cousin, a random look-alike. "Yes," Emmy said. The word hung in the air, heavy and impossible. "But—" Mason stammered, his mind reeling back 10 years. "The funeral. I was there. I saw the casket. I saw the flowers. You told me she died, Emmy. You told me the leukemia took her." "I told you the treatment failed," Emmy corrected him, her voice smooth and deadly. "There is a difference. You lied to me. For a decade," Mason shouted. The guard in the corner took a step forward, hand resting on his baton. Mason recoiled, lowering his voice to a frantic hiss. How? Why? Emmy leaned in closer to the glass. Her eyes were hard, like diamond drills. Do you remember the night the doctors gave us the ultimatum, Mason? June 14th, 2015? It was a Tuesday. Mason shook his head. I don't know dates. I was busy. You were always busy, Emmy said. The doctors said the standard chemo wasn't working. They said there was a specialist in Zurich, a new immunotherapy protocol. It had a 90% success rate, but it wasn't covered by insurance. It required an upfront cash payment of $2 million. Mason blinked. A vague memory surfaced. A frantic phone call. Emmy crying. Him standing on the balcony of a hotel in Macau. I remember, Mason whispered. I told you to handle it. No, Emmy said. You told me. And I quote, $2 million is a lot of liquidity for a 90% chance, Emmy. The prognosis is poor. It's a bad investment. Let her go comfortably. The words hit Mason like physical blows. He remembered saying them. He remembered thinking he was being pragmatic. He was in the middle of the Techstar acquisition. He needed the cash. He had detached himself from the fatherhood aspect and looked at his daughter as a depreciating asset. I didn't mean it like that, Mason stammered. I was under pressure. You put a price tag on her life, and you decided she wasn't worth the overhead, Emmy said. So, I made a decision. I forged your signature on the transfer. I liquidated your precious vintage car collection to cover the rest. I sent her to Zurich alone with my mother. But the funeral? A play, Emmy said with a shrug. Theatre for an audience of one. You. I knew if she survived, you would never let her go. You would use her. You would turn her recovery into a PR stunt to boost stock prices. You would parade her around as the miracle child while ignoring her just as you did before. I had to kill her on paper to save her in real life. Mason felt tears pricking his eyes. She's alive. My little girl is alive. She is not your little girl, Emmy said sharply. She is a grown woman. She grew up in boarding schools in Switzerland and France. She speaks 4 languages. She plays the cello. She is brilliant, and she knows exactly who you are. Does she ask about me? Emmy let out a short, dry laugh. It was a cruel sound. Ask about you? Mason, she studied you. Who do you think found the Cayman accounts? Mason froze. The blood drained from his face. You thought Arthur Pendergast was a wizard. Emmy shook her head. Arthur is good, but he's old school. The encryption you used on the Omega Fund was military grade. It needed a genius to crack it. It needed someone who understood the architecture of your lies. Emmy placed her hand against the glass. Rory wrote the crawler code, Mason. She spent 2 years mapping your digital footprint. She tracked every dollar you stole. She found the mistresses. She found the shell companies. She built the trap. Mason slumped back on the stool. The irony was suffocating. The daughter he had written off as a bad investment had grown up to be the architect of his bankruptcy. She hates me that much? He whispered, his voice breaking. She doesn't hate you, Mason, Emmy said, her voice softening into something even more terrifying. Pity. Hate implies passion. She views you as obsolete code, a glitch in the system that needed to be patched. Emmy stood up. She smoothed the front of her coat. She looked at her watch, a simple, elegant movement that signaled the end of his time and the end of his relevance. Why did you come here, Emmy? Mason asked, tears streaming down his face now. To gloat? Rory wanted me to deliver a message, Emmy said. She's legally changing her name tomorrow. She's taking my maiden name. She will be Aurora Vance. No. Mason reached out, his fingers clawing uselessly at the smooth glass. "She's a sterling. That's my legacy." "Your legacy is a prison number," Emmy said. "She wanted you to know that the company is in safe hands. We're using the $200 million you stole, the money recovered by her code, to fund a new pediatric oncology wing in Zurich. We're naming it after the daughter you refused to save." Emmy turned toward the door. "Wait!" Mason screamed, the panic rising in his chest, a tidal wave of realization that he was truly, utterly alone. "Emmy, please, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I love her." Emmy paused. She didn't turn around. She simply spoke to the steel door in front of her. "I asked her if she wanted to come today, if she wanted to see you." "What did she say?" Mason begged. "She said she was busy working," Emmy replied. "She said the ROI on visiting you wasn't high enough." The heavy door slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. Mason dropped the phone. It swung by its cord, hitting the metal wall with a dull thud. He pressed his forehead against the cold plexiglass, staring at the empty chair where his wife had sat. He had spent his life worshipping the god of returns, of margins, of the bottom line. He had sacrificed everything, his wife, his child, his humanity, on the altar of success. And in the end, the ledger had balanced itself. He was a billionaire in a cage of his own making, bankrupt in the only currency that mattered. Mason Sterling slid to the dirty floor, curled into a ball, and for the first time in 20 years, he wept. Not for the money he lost, but for the daughter who had calculated his worth and found it to be zero. And that is how Mason Sterling, the man who thought he was the king of New York, ended up a pauper in a prison cell, destroyed by the two women he underestimated the most. He thought power came from money, from suits, and from intimidation. He forgot that the most dangerous force on earth is a mother protecting her child, and a daughter who remembers. Mason spent the rest of his days watching ether dynamics rise to global dominance from a fuzzy TV screen, knowing that every success, every breakthrough, and every dollar earned was a direct message from his daughter. "I didn't need you." If you enjoyed this story of karma, betrayal, and ultimate revenge, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. What would you have done if you were Emmy? Would you have hidden the daughter or confronted him sooner? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.